I pretended to be at rock bottom. My children turned their backs on me, except the one I hated. I know how that sounds. I am Veridiana. I am 68 years old. I have lived long enough to have sat at many tables where people toasting my name believed they knew me, believed they loved me. I built a life that looked unassailable. The house with the wide bay windows, the silver that always gleamed when guests arrived, invitations that arrived before the dates were set. I married a man with hands that smelled of oil and ambition, Roberto, and we made a life that glittered. The glitter blinded me, and perhaps it blinded those around me too. The divorce was a wound that opened slow and then tore. Roberto left the year I first noticed the lines at the corners of my mouth more than in any mirror. The betrayal was not sudden. It had been threaded through years of small removals. Dinners cancelled, apologies that tasted like convenience, a life rearranged around someone else's calendar. When the papers were finally placed before me, when the lawyer across from me clicked his pen and named figures that would, for most people, have been a fortune, I held the pen and signed, not because I had to, not because I needed to, because I wanted to see. I will tell you plainly, what I did was cruel and eager and selfish in ways I am not proud of. That is the first and necessary truth. I did it to test my children. I wanted to know who loved me for me, not for the house, the clothes, the parties. I wanted to know, in the clean light of humiliation, who would stand with me in the rain. The lawyer's office smelled of lemon polish and the kind of paper heavy with consequence. Roberto's attorney sat behind an enormous desk, and when he slid a thick envelope toward me, it made a sound like a verdict. "We can make this quiet," he said. "A settlement, accommodations for your future, no press. You accept what is offered and everyone walks away untroubled." His voice was smooth as a polished coin. I looked at him and at the numbers printed on the document. The math was obscene and absurd, and in a private corner of my mind, boring. Money had never been the only currency in my life. It had been a language I spoke without thinking. The offer, though, gave me an idea as wicked as it was clear. "I will sign," I heard myself say, and the pen in my hand felt heavier than the one Roberto had used at the end of our vows. "But I will accept, as if I lose it all." He raised an eyebrow. "As if?" "As if," I repeated. "There are decisions you make that you think are small enough to contain." This was not small. I did not tell the lawyer the whole plan. He believed I wanted privacy. Roberto believed he had secured his image. My children believed they were inheritors of my life's pattern. Only I knew the true cruelty of the experiment I was about to carry out. I left that room with documents folded like a mitre under my arm and a quiet, malicious certainty in my chest. It is a strange thing, to sign away the safety net when you can still feel its edge under your toes. The world around me did not change immediately. My hairdresser still asked about our vacation plans. The housekeeper inquired if I preferred the usual red roses or peonies. I walked the same hardwood floors with the same soft slippers on my feet. But I began to practice dismantling myself in private. I will not teach you how to do what I did. I will tell you what I did because you deserve to know the full consequences, the small cruelties and the large awakenings. I took my cards and my phones and my spare keys, and I put them in a box. I sealed the box as one would a time capsule, except there was no hope it would be opened with gentleness. I donated the designer coats and took a bag of clothes to a thrift shop on a rainy Tuesday. Standing under the droop of the awning, I watched the rain draw lines on the pavement, and it felt like the first honest weather of my life. The thrift store had that particular smell of people's pasts, the faint ghost of perfume that lingered in altered collars, the dry must of fabric that had loved another body. I found a coat with a faded collar that hugged me too tightly at the shoulders, and a wool scarf frayed at the ends. I bought a pair of shoes 2 sizes too small because they were the only sensible thing left. The clerk, a young man with a pierced eyebrow, who moved like he had already been disappointed by most of life, wrapped the items for me without asking why a woman my age would leave so much behind. I liked that he did not ask. I did not embrace squalor. I did not make my life into a spectacle of misery. I chose the margins where my ego would bruise and my children's choices would show. I painted my nails with a cheap polish that chipped in days, and I learned to curl my hair less because it was less impressive when it fell flat in humidity. I practiced patience with the collar of my thrift coat that bled color into my wrists when the rain hit it hard. The first night I set out, rain tapping the city like a nervous audience, I walked to Rogerio's building. He was the eldest, buttoned, polished, a man who had learned early that appearances kept doors open. He was a lawyer now, and his duplex smelled of leather and rehabilitation. The lobby was guarded by a proper man who knew which deliveries belonged to which families and which visitors were permitted passage. I pressed my wet hair from my face and waited at the glass, the city's light reflecting off the puddles like little expectations. When Rogerio opened the door, his hair was combed with the same heavy streak that had defined his whole life, meticulously straight, unrevealing. He looked at me the way a man looks at a witness he does not intend to call to testify. "Mother," he said, as if the word itself could be a thermometer and measure the temperature between us. "I had a flat," I said. My voice surprised me with how small it sounded. "Can I come in just to dry off for a moment?" He glanced past me as if assessing whether a wet presence would stain the polished carpet. "There are rules in the building," he replied. "I can't—" His hand hung in the air, a white flag for civility. "Would you like a taxi? I can have my assistant." "No," I said. The wetness along my scarf made me cold and furious. I thought I might come up, just for a minute. There was a long, polite silence, the kind families used to measure distances. He smiled like a man offering a courtesy he did not intend to give. "I can give you some money for a hotel," he said finally, and he reached into his pocket and extracted a card and a folded bill, as if performing a small necessary transaction. "Take a cab. It's the most sensible thing." I remember the weight of the bill in my hand later, clean, crisp, the sort of emergency cash people hand over with peripheral guilt. A man at the entrance took my umbrella and said, "You should go, ma'am," with a tenderness that was almost mocking. He was doing what Rogerio could not, treating me as a problem to be managed, not a mother to be embraced. I left with my dignity pinched into a corner and the taste of gravel in my mouth. Rogerio's refusal pulsed in me as more than irritation, it was a scalpel. The next day I went to Patricia's. She drove a car that compartmentalized people by their ability to reflect her image with favor. Her husband was the sort of surgeon whose hands were measured against time and consequence. Their life was a curated feed of weekend getaways and lunches that blurred into art. I found her in front of a cafe, lip gloss and impatience at the edge of her smile. When she saw me, she leaned across her passenger seat as though the window were not a barrier, but a test. "Mother," she said, with that syllable wrapped in something that might once have been concern, but had been polished into performance. "Are you all right?" I remember something like a laugh wanting to come out of my throat, a brittle sound, embarrassed. "I'm fine," I lied. "I was in the neighborhood." She flicked the end of her hair, a practiced move. "You shouldn't be out in this weather. Tell me where you are. I'll drive you somewhere." Her hands gripped the wheel, and the world outside her window was always slightly softer because she controlled it. There was kindness there, thinly veiled, but it came with a condition. We would leave when she decided the scene was acceptable. "Could I just borrow your phone for a moment?" I asked, the smallest of requests. She looked at me, and for a second I think she was trying to remember the contours of the mother she had known as a child, but she only managed a sympathetic tilt. "I can call someone to come pick you up," she offered. "I can have the housekeeper." "I don't want to trouble anyone," I said. "I thought I might sit and wait until the rain stops." Her lips pressed into a line, and she put the car in drive. "I'm sorry," she said, and there was a glossy layer over the apology, like varnish over wood. "We're late for a consultation. I can't." The window came up between us as if a judge had banged a gavel. Whether she did it to protect herself from the sight of my wet hair, or because she feared I might insist on something messy, I cannot say. The car drove off, and she left me standing in the drizzle with my thrift coat clinging to my shoulders like a bad decision. The sound of her tires was an accusation. Walking away from Patricia, I felt something inside me crack a little further. Pride had taught me to measure love by presence and investment. Had I been measuring it correctly? Or had I been blinded by the gifts and the easy part of charity, the parts that show publicly and elegantly? My felled illusions were soaked through like my sleeves. I had not expected how small the refusals would make me feel. I had imagined that my children would brave small inconveniences for me, the same way they had let me make choices in their youth. I had not imagined the literal physical sharpness of being shut out. By the time I reached Kayo's neighborhood, the rain had thickened into something more determined. The buildings grew older, and angles softened by time. Kayo's block smelled different. Bread warm from ovens, laundry damp, the steady sound of a radio that did not care to be heard beyond a single window. He was the youngest, the one labeled by family gossip as the black sheep, a teacher of history who loved the past for its stubborn, inconvenient truths. He had taken less, chosen less, and in the quiet of his choice there was a tenderness I had rarely allowed myself to see. His house, if you could call a narrow, light-filled flat a house, opened into a kitchen where the stove had the seasoning of meals made out of little means and large generosity. I stood on his stoop and hesitated. The door opened before I could knock. Sita was there, wrapped in an old sweatshirt with flour on her hands, and when she saw me her face split in that open way that makes rooms larger. Come in, she said, and she did not ask questions. She took my coat and wrapped a towel around my shoulders with impatient tenderness, as if she had been waiting for this sort of rescue all her life and did not like to see it delayed. Her hands were warm and smelled faintly of citrus and bread. You're soaking, she said. You poor thing. Sit by the stove. Kayo hovered in the doorway, his hair rumpled, his eyes the kind that a person sees too late and realizes they had been measuring wrong. Mother? He said, and there was a softness to the word that I had not felt in the 2 previous encounters. He did not step back or fuss or offer to send me away. He stepped forward and kissed the top of my head the way people sometimes do when they are trying to make a map of where to heal someone. Inside, the light was amber and forgiving. The table was scarred with the memory of many meals and many conversations. A pot sat simmering on the stove, and the smell of onions and tomato wrapped around me like a memory. Sita put a cup of tea into my hands and sat across from me with an ease I had not seen from my own sons for decades. She asked me about my coat, as if coats could tell a story, and she seemed not to care that mine was thrifted. Where did you find that? She asked, and when I said the name of the shop, she nodded as if this were a fact that mattered less than the hands that had found the coat. They fed me with an economy that was not stinginess. It was the kind of sharing that removes the idea of ledger and replaces it with presence. Sita fetched a blanket and wrapped it around me like a small, honest apology. Kayo opened a window to let the damp air escape and leaned against the sill as if the rain could be kept out of the room simply by acknowledging it. They listened to me in a way the others did not. There was no performance, no measuring of words for future gossip. Sita dried my hair with a towel that smelled of lemon and laundry soap and the touch of a woman who had not been given the luxury of arrogance. She hummed under her breath while she worked, and when she hummed, I felt something unnameable ease in my chest. We ate the stew, and it was excellent in a way that made the expensive dinners I had once hosted feel hollow. It had the grit of real sustenance. Sita told me about the neighbor's cat and the rent that had gone up again, and Kayo made a joke about one of his students who was convinced Napoleon had been from the southern region, a joke that made us all laugh. They made room for me on the sofa, and when I closed my eyes I could hear the clock in the hallway and the city breathing outside. For the first time since I began my experiment, the warmth felt not like a showroom, but like a refuge. That night, they insisted I sleep in their small spare room. It's the couch or the spare, Sita said, balancing practicality with care. Pick. I chose the bed because I was tired of choosing small things. They laid out fresh sheets and made a place for my slippers by the side, and I felt a ridiculous new gratitude for a place where someone had thought to tuck your feet in as if you were a child. The next morning, the rain had slowed to a polite drizzle, and the flat smelled of toast and coffee. I woke with the clean, heavy feeling of someone who has passed a threshold. Kayo had a stack of books on the table and scribbled notes curling from the edges. Sita had breakfast ready and sat beside me as if we were equals at the table. I had never felt so quietly seen. When I reached for my pills that afternoon, I discovered their absence. In my days of dismantling, I had lost track of small things. My medication had been in the box with the cards. A small concrete panic rose in me, not because I feared illness alone, but because the absence of those tiny, necessary routines snapped a cord in me that connected me to the life I had left behind. My hands shook as I searched cabinets and purses. They must be around here, I told myself aloud, but the words were brittle. Sita noticed. She was washing the one pot by the sink when she asked casually, "You need your pills?" I admitted the truth. They're in the box. I thought I had more. I thought... She looked at me with a softness that made my skin ache. We can get something else for now. I'll call the pharmacy. No, I said quickly, the pride in me rebelling. No, you don't have to. She cut me off with a look. We'll handle it, she said. I'll sell something if I must. Her eyes were steady and fierce, and they landed on a small chain hanging from a hook near the stove. A thin gold chain with a pendant I recognized. My mother's medal, a little figure of Our Lady, the small thing I had worn under blouses for years. The pendant meant more to me than any account balance because it had been the one piece of my mother that had survived decades and divorces and renovations. Sita's hand hovered near the chain, almost involuntary. I could pawn this, she said quietly, as if saying it aloud might summon miracle or judgment. It's taken care of us before. Her voice had no theatricality, only the simple arithmetic of a woman who knows the exact weight of sacrifice. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I do not remember the sequence of thoughts that flashed through my mind, the practical, the ridiculous, the guilty. The experiment I had devised to expose the conditional love of my children was now threatening the dignity of those who had already given me everything they could without question. I sat at the kitchen table, the mug of cooling tea between my hands, and felt each one of the decisions I had made like a stone in my pocket. This is what I wanted to find out, I said to myself, but the phrase sounded like a confession in a confessional church, louder and more public than I had intended. Sita stood up, her face composed as ever. It's only until we can get something, she said. She began to gather the few pieces of jewelry she kept in a modest tin in the drawer. Her movements were calm and efficient, the way someone folds a shirt to hide the grief in the fabric. She picked up the little medal and put it on the counter as if it were both fragile and powerful, and I watched as her hands closed around that small cross of memory. I felt hot, suddenly, the flush of shame mixed with a rising irrational fury. How could I have allowed this? How could I have engineered such pain? Sita meant to protect me in the only currency she had, the sentimental treasure that bound generations. She thought her sacrifice was noble, a way to undo the embarrassment of my pretending. I could have stopped her right there. I could have unmasked myself and told her everything. I could have declared that my accounts were untouched, that the whole thing was a test, ended the experiment, and spared the chestaches to come. But then I thought of the 2 doors, slammed or closed, the ones who had not extended their hands. I thought of the flat bill Rogerio folded and gave me. I thought of Patricia's window snapping shut like a verdict. The desire to see the entire picture burned in me. I wanted to know if the people I loved would place their dignity, their inheritance, their scant objects of memory on the altar for me. I wanted evidence. It was a terrible and selfish hunger. Sita set the jewelry aside and walked back to me. We'll figure it out, she said, and she smiled in the way people do when they hide their own tremor to steady another. We always do. I nodded. I did not tell her that the medal she was willing to sell had once belonged to my mother and that I had worn it in my wedding. I did not tell her how many times I had pressed it to my lips when decisions loomed. I did not tell her that the thing she was about to sacrifice was a piece of me. I let her move as if it were her choice, because it was. I was the architect of this moment, and the guilt pressed like an old coin against my sternum. I sat there, the kettle boiling soft at the back of the stove, the rain making small constellations on the window, and I listened to them move about the apartment. Caio was making notes for a lecture, and the scratch of his pen was steady and domestic. Sita hummed as she folded a dishcloth. The radio played quietly, and a neighbor's child laughed outside as if our dramas were only background noise to a life that proceeds regardless. The plan had been to push them gently, to test the bonds? Instead, the plan had sharpened into a threat, a near violence against the only thing that belonged to me beyond the accounts and deeds. I felt at once like a fool and a thief, and for the first time in many years I could not simply disguise either feeling. I stood up and moved toward the counter, toward the tin where Sita had set the small medal. For a moment my fingers trembled above it, not daring to touch. I thought of taking it, of saying, "No, you cannot sell this." It would have spared her, preserved something sacred, and undone the exposure of her generosity. But the experiment had to continue. Some stubborn part of me insisted. To the bitter end, perhaps to the point of cruelty. As my hand hovered, the city outside exhaled, rain thinning to a hush. Inside, a small drama surged and swelled, and for the first time the experiment turned inward, looking back and revealing more about me than about anyone else. I could feel the truth settling like a weight. The people who had stood by me without question were few, and one of them was the one I had always treated with condescension. I had planned to humiliate my children to see who loved me. What I had not planned for was the price that would be paid by those who already loved me best. Saida reached for the tin then, with a hand that was practical and brave. "We'll sell it if we must," she said again, and the sentence landed like a bell. I opened my mouth, and for once the words came out without the armor of wit. "Stop," I said. My voice was small, to my own surprise. The almost imperceptible soupçon of command in it came from a place I had not visited in a long time. Humility. Sita paused, balancing the tin between her palms as if it were evidence of some larger truth. She looked up at me, eyebrow lifted in the confused question of a person who has offered everything and wonders suddenly if it was all a mistake. "I'm sorry," I said, and the apology had a shape and edges in my mouth I had neglected for decades. "I should have told you, this was my idea. I am the cause of this." Her eyes did not harden. They softened, like linen left in rain and then ironed. "You could have told us," she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, only a quiet knowledge. "But we're here now." I nodded and sank into a chair as if someone had taken the floor from under me. The kettle hissed, and the city seemed to hold its breath. This was where the consequence landed, not in the numbers on a sheet of paper, but in hands that would either give up their keepsakes for me or keep them and go on. The experiment had become a mirror I could not walk away from without blood on my hands, figuratively and perhaps quite literally. I had meant to discover who would stand in the rain with me. I had not meant to make anyone sell their mother's memory to do it. The moral scale tipped, and I felt my appetite for revelation die in my throat. The test, I realized, had already answered the question I had asked it to ask. The answer was ugly and honest, and would not sit well in a chest already furred with pride. Outside, the rain picked up again, and I could not decide whether it was crying for me or simply remembering how to fall. I wanted to unmake what I had set in motion, to erase the cunning and replace it with an honest confession. But the act of confession requires a moment chosen with care. It requires the courage of exposure in front of the people you have misplaced. I had to decide whether to unmask myself in private with Sita and Kayo, or to unmask in the presence of all my children, to make a public accounting that would either redeem me or splinter those relationships permanently. I looked at the little medal on the counter, at Saida's hands folded around the tin, and felt the heavy, obvious truth close in. There is a limit to what we can test in others without testing ourselves. The next decision would be the one that told the full story, not of who loved me, but of who I wanted to be. There was a door to open now, and it would not be a small one. There was a door to open now, and it would not be a small one. I called a friend I trusted, only one, and asked her to book the little room at a restaurant I had once hosted a charity luncheon in. I told her to make it private, to keep it calm, to bring water and bread, and a quiet server. Then, on a wet Thursday that felt appropriate, I sent the invitations myself. No flourish, not the embossed cards I'd once used. An email to each of my children that said simply, "Dinner Friday, please come." Before I sent them, I sat with the words I would say. I practiced humility in my head in the same way I had once practiced the articulation of my speeches, until the edges rounded and sounded less like performance and more like possibility. I rehearsed admitting greed. I rehearsed the name of my sin, cruelty. I rehearsed asking for forgiveness without expecting it to be given. One small thing tugged at me, the legalities. I phoned the lawyer who had slid the envelope to me at the table of settlement. He answered with a voice smooth as always. "You signed it," he reminded me. "What now?" "I need to change things," I said. "I want my money to go where love was shown, not where it was convenient. Come Friday, no press." His silence was a thin acknowledgement. "Bring the documents," he said finally. "If this is to be done, do it legally." I spent that night in a way that would have been scandalous to my former self. I ironed a tablecloth I had not ironed in years. Not a white linen of parade dinners, but a cotton one with a pattern of small blue flowers I liked, because it did not pretend to be anything other than a cloth. I placed the medal my mother had worn beside the napkin ring, and fell asleep feeling like a person who had decided to remodel her own heart. The restaurant room smelled of lemon and linen when I arrived. The rain tapped the windows like a witness. I watched the door as if it might keep a secret from me. One by one they came. Rogerio arrived first, late, methodical, his suit cut as clean as his silence. He sat upright as though posture were an argument. He acknowledged the room with a clipped nod and sat opposite me. Patricia breezed in next, hair like an announcement, perfume like applause. She smiled with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to favor. Then Caio came, sleeves rolled, tired and real, with Sita close behind, flour on her apron as if she had just stepped out of their kitchen to steady herself for what was next. For a moment, the seven of us looked like a family photograph in the making, the kind my grandchildren might take someday if we ever learned how to be photographed without pretending. I spoke first because I had to. My voice trembled at the edges in a way my friends would later call humility, my enemies would call affectation. I told them the truth. I told them why I had signed the settlement, as if I had nothing, why I had closed the doors and stepped into the rain. I told them the cruelty of my plan, and I did it without the armor of explanation. I said, I did this to find out who loved me when nothing remained to give. It was a test, a terrible idea. I am sorry. Rogerio's first reaction was not outrage, but incredulity. He leaned forward as if to catch a thread that might unravel the story into nonsense. You did what? He asked, voice steadier than his face. You put yourself into what exactly? To prove what? That people only care about money? That is what I had suspected, I said. That is what I wanted to see with my own eyes. Patricia's mouth flattened. You used us, she said, not looking at me. You used your children. I used myself first, I replied. The honesty of the sentence felt like a coal in my hand. I wanted clarity. I did not think carefully enough about the cost to others. Rogerio bristled. And then you let Caio and Sida. He could not finish. It was obvious which sentence he wanted to deliver. Put themselves next to you. Instead he said, cool as a courtroom. This is irresponsible. It was, I agreed, and cruel. I do not excuse it. Silence fell, and was served like the first course. The waiter walked around us, unobtrusive, and refilled water. Patricia's fingers found a wineglass she did not intend to touch, like a talisman. Sita sat with her hands folded, as if containing the storm on her knees. Caio watched me the way a man watches his fragile instrument, as if he were to look away it might break. Why tell us now? Patricia asked finally. Why the dramatics? Why bring this? She gestured vaguely at the room, at the rain. To dinner? Because, I said, the experiment has already told me what I needed to know about other people. Now I must correct the damage I have done. I am here to make an accounting. Rogerio snorted. An accounting? You meant to humiliate us. An accounting isn't making up for... It's not enough, I allowed. An apology isn't enough. So I brought a lawyer. At the mention of the lawyer, the room shifted. The man himself had stayed just outside the door, taking in the hush of the table like a judge. He produced a small stack of papers, trusts and directives. Not the flashy settlement documents we'd signed months earlier, but carefully worded instruments that could redirect inheritance, fund education, create a home ownership plan, set up endowments for causes I believed in. He set them on the table like a new offer. I explained what I wanted to do, each sentence chosen for clarity and for the dignity of the people who had been kind to me. Not the whole fortune, there would be enough to meet obligations and to live, but enough to make a visible, honest turn toward those who had loved me without calculation. I told them I would be redirecting sums to create a fund for Caio's community programs and for Sita's education, so she could pursue whatever training she wanted without selling keepsakes. I told them I wanted the house in which I had lived for decades to be repurposed if necessary into a community space, not as a palace for one branch of the family. I wanted the accounts to be managed so that wealth would enable work, not spectacle. Rogerio's eyes narrowed. You can't just, he began. I can, the lawyer said quietly. With her signature, she owns these assets. Patricia's face had gone white. But our inheritance... This is not about punishment, I interrupted. This is not revenge. It is correction. I will not let money pass to hands that were absent when it mattered. I am not disinheriting you to punish you. My voice broke then, the small tremor of a woman who had relied longer on being right than on being kind. I am redirecting it toward those who gave me care when I needed it. Rogerio's fist tightened on the table. You think you can judge who deserves it? You think a single dinner can absolve you of the choices you made as a parent? I am not looking for absolution, I said, and I felt, for the first time that evening, honest. I am trying to weigh my choices against their consequences. I made a terrible decision. I am making what reparation I can. The words hung between us like breath. I could see calculations running behind Rogerio's eyes. He measured the threat to his future. Patricia measured the public scene and how it might reflect on her. I could not control their ambitions. I could only set my own course. You will sign now? Rogerio said finally. You will make this public now at this table? No, I said, not public, legal, private enough. But yes, I will sign, and I will ask that what I fund be handled transparently and respectfully. We spent the next hour like people trying to stitch a torn fabric without the original thread. The lawyer asked questions about beneficiaries, about trustees. I named Caio and Saida as primary stewards, not because they needed money so much as because they had shown me the kind of stewardship I wanted to encourage. Humility, a willingness to share, a desire to build rather than to maintain facade. We discussed the purchase of a smaller house, close to Caio's students, with a large table that would not be a symbol but a tool, and a scholarship fund so that Sida might take courses in hospitality management, or whatever she wished, without selling pieces of the past. Rogerio was not satisfied. You're cutting me off, he said. You can't do that. Legally I can, the lawyer replied. But personally, that will be between you and her. Patricia's lower lip trembled. Do you even understand what you're doing? She asked, not so much accusing as demanding to be understood. I understand enough, I said. I understand that I mistook loyalty for applause. I understand that I encouraged a game where appearances mattered more than hearts. I understand that my children were raised in a house that taught them how to be liked and how to be seen, not always how to be faithful. I am trying to teach myself now how to repair that. They argued in fits and starts. There were shouts under polite voices, then quiet accusations that were sharper because they did not have the roar of entitlement behind them. At one point, Rogerio stood as if to leave, his jaw set, but something in the sight of Caida, her steady face, the quietness of her endurance, made him sit back down. He looked older in that moment, as if the years of polish he had collected could not fully smooth what had happened. When the documents were finally signed, my hand imprinting a new map of obligations and care, the relief I had expected did not come. Instead, there was a slow, aching lightness, as if a stone had been moved and the body was still learning to walk without it. My children, those who had accepted invitations because they always had, left with their own judgments in their pockets. I paid the bill and walked into the rain, not because it matched my plot now, but because I needed to know if the world felt different with the choices made. Rogerio's last look was complicated. There was anger there certainly, but also the undercurrent of someone who had not realized his own fragility until it was called forth. Patricia drove away with her face set, not even glancing back. Caio and Sida walked with me to the car park under the same drizzle that had been my test and now washed something else from my shoulders. We did not speak much. We did not need to. The small kindnesses were the same ones that had saved me earlier. A hand on my sleeve, a shared umbrella, the way Sida hurried along to keep up. In the weeks that followed, the legal work continued. I signed papers that named trustees and administrators. I met with financial advisors not to learn how to hide wealth, but to ensure it would serve a purpose I believed in. We established a community program for Caio, a modest grant to help him take some of his history classes into the neighborhoods that had shaped him. We set up a fund for Sida so she could enroll in a course that would be hers to complete without ever having to mortgage a memory. We began the process of purchasing a modest house, not as an estate, but as a home, one with a kitchen large enough for a table where many hands could be fed, and where the arguments of the past could be transformed into conversations that built. Handling money this way changed the shape of my days. Instead of the dizzying pleasure of acquisition, my mornings became full of calls with project managers and enrollment offices. I visited Caio's classroom and listened to him teach about revolutions and small resistances. There was a humility in how his students sat and absorbed him, not because they idolized him, but because his lessons made them see their pasts as instruments of agency rather than ornaments of nostalgia. I sat in the back of a lecture hall once and felt something I had not felt in years, pride unconnected to spectacle. Sita enrolled in a hospitality course and studied with the fervor of someone who had already practiced kindness as a trade. She learned to manage inventory and menu planning with the same care she applied to the small miracles of home cooking. She was brilliant at the practical aspects and tender at the heart of it. She wanted, in her words, to turn generosity into a livelihood that would feed others and pay rent. Our new house took months. We found a place with creaky floors, a sunlit kitchen, and a garden that had once been a lawn for a different life. The lawyer put it in a trust that permitted me to live under the same roof as Caio and Sita for as long as I wished, and then pass stewardship to them when I was gone. It was the most legalistic form of family I had ever known, binding but flexible, generous but protected. We painted the dining room a soft yellow. We bought a table long enough to hold a crowd. Friends made pilaf and brought plates. The table became the center of our days in the way I had once imagined the bay windows of my old home might be. Only this time, the windows looked out on a street that knew how to be honest with us. Living with Caio and Sita was at once ordinary and remedial. I learned to set the table with plates instead of place settings that matched by pedigree. I learned how to do laundry without delegating it as a ritual of status. I learned to ask how someone's day truly was and to wait for the answer without interrupting it to tell them mine. There were nights when I fumbled these new customs horribly. One evening I tried to insist on paying for dinner and was met with Sida's fierce refusal, then a quiet conversation about dignity and pride. I learned slowly how to be loved without a contract. There were still moments that hurt. Rogerio visited rarely, and when he did, he brought platitudes that landed like foreign coins. Polite, useful, but not made for the table we had now. Patricia's calls were brief and precise, as if she feared that sentimentality was contagious. There were times when the absence bit, and I had to remind myself the decision to invite consequence into our relations had been mine. I could not and would not erase their choices. I could only live with mine and attempt to make restitution. People asked about my test, as if there were a moral to be peddled. I learned to say plainly that the experiment had been cruel and a failure in many moral dimensions. It had exposed not only the character of my children, but the character of my heart. It had served as a mirror that I had placed in front of others and then had to step in front of myself. I apologized publicly in small circles, to friends who had been embarrassed by the spectacle, to neighbors who had been gossiped into taking sides. I did not try to justify. I did not say this was a lesson I recommend. I said instead, I am sorry, I did something wrong, and I am trying to fix it. Months turned to a pattern, and pattern turned into slower healing. The centerpiece of that healing was the table. The first meal we hosted there was not a proclamation but a prosaic Tuesday. Stew, bread, and apple tart Sita made without fuss. We invited neighbors and a few of Caio's students to come. They sat around and argued about small things, history, football, the taste of childhood jam, and the table held the conversation without judgment. I watched a young woman, maybe 22, reach across to pass the bread to someone she hardly knew and feel something in me loosen like a tightened string. I took the medal from its place on the shelf, my mother's piece, one afternoon, and handed it to Sita. You once reached to sell it, I said. I want you to have it now, not because I need to tether memory to you, but because I want you to remember what you almost did and why you did it. Let it be for you, if you want it. Sita's face crumpled for a second. She put the chain around her neck and pressed it like a talisman to her chest. I don't need it to remind me, she said. But I'll keep it to remind us both. There were reconciliations in the small, stubborn way people who love imperfectly reconcile. Rogerio and I had a conversation one cold afternoon on the new back porch. He did not apologize, but he did come, and we spoke of practical things. How to handle family events with dignity, how to teach the next generation to be stewards and not collectors. He brought his granddaughter a book of maps for a birthday, and read to her badly but with attention. I forgave him in increments, the kind of forgiveness that fits into a cup and is sipped rather than swallowed whole. Patricia and I never recovered our old intimacy. Her world and mine continued to orbit differently, but she was present for a funeral last winter and came afterward and held my hand without words. Sometimes that is enough. The rain returned, months after that first test, not as accusation but as an old friend. I sat one evening on the porch of our new home, wrapped in a blanket Sida had knitted, watching water trace paths down the pavement. I thought of that first wet walk, and of the shame that had burned in me like a confession. I wondered, not for the first time, whether the cost had been worth it. The answer did not arrive as a trumpet or a miracle. It arrived as a soft succession of small things. The sight of Kayo teaching, the smell of bread when Sida came home from a class, the laughter around a table that once had been an instrument of display and had become finally a place of real work. I found that I could live with the consequences because they had moved me to do something honest. I had repaired imperfectly what I had broken. I do not want to romanticize that work. There were nights when I lay awake and felt like a vandal. There were times when a name, Rogerio or Patricia, entered my head like an accusation and would not leave. There were moments when I wanted to run back to my old life and set everything right with silver and satin. But the new pleasures had a durability my old ones lacked. They were messy and slow, and they required me to be present in ordinary ways I had never learned to be before. People asked me, awkwardly at first, and then with increasing curiosity, whether I would ever recover my reputation. I told them the truth. Reputation is fragile, integrity is harder. I preferred the latter. It meant fewer appearances, fewer invitations from those who liked me for the view my life gave them of themselves. It meant more time with people who would sit with me in the rain if necessary. Because the truth of my experiment had been revealed, the people who had shown themselves to me did so without parade afterward. Kayo students benefited from a modest grant to bring history lessons into community centers. Sida enrolled in night classes and then surprised us all by starting a small catering business that supplied meals to local schools, simple, hearty food, and an ethic of dignity with every portion. We used some of the funds to make a down payment on the house where we lived, not as an estate, but as a place to host workshops and community dinners. We bought the long table and a set of mismatched chairs that fit hands, not eulogies. On a Saturday afternoon months later, we invited a few neighbors, people who had always been there in small ways, and the room buzzed with conversation. A young mother I recognized from the market spoke to Kayo about a history project for her son. Sida laughed with a baker who taught her a trick with yeast. The house held more languages than my old one had ever tolerated, the bluntness of the working week and the patient melody of someone practicing a new trade. Sometimes, at night, I would stand at the kitchen window and look out at the street. Rain would come or would not. The city would live and breathe without waiting to be judged. I would think of my mother, the woman who had worn the medal I still sometimes touch for luck, and imagine what she might think of me now. She would probably say, in the voice of a woman who knew less about strategy and more about survival, "You learned something late, but you learned it." Learning late is not the same as not learning. The delay made the lessons larger and, in some ways, more costly. But cost and value are not synonyms. I had paid dearly, and the payment had bought me clarity. That clarity had a cost still. There were fractured things that could not be made to look like they had not once been broken. Some relationships would remain in the bruise stage, others would knit, sometimes in crooked, admirable ways. On the anniversary of the night I walked into the rain, I invited a few neighbors and friends to the table. It was not meant to be a commemoration of theatrical cruelty, but a simple observation of survival. We ate stew and bread, and Kayo told a story about a small rebellion in a village that had changed the course of a town's harvest. I looked at the faces around me, some familiar from my old life, some new, and understood that the wealth I had sought to measure before had always been of a different kind. True wealth, I learned, had little to do with linens and much to do with hands that reach and stay. There is a question I ask myself sometimes, one I now ask with less malice and more curiosity. Who would stand with you if you lost everything? When it came to my children, the answers were mixed. Some stood, some offered help with conditions, some walked away. That distinction hurt, but it also taught me where to place my trust going forward. It taught me to invest in people who had proven themselves not by inheritance, but by action. I do not recommend anyone follow the path I cut, sharp and self-inflicted. I do not encourage tests of loyalty. They are a dangerous thing, an entanglement of ego and expectation that can wound the best of hearts. If you are tempted to recreate what I did, please do not. There are kinder ways to learn about people. Ask hard questions, be vulnerable without weaponizing it, and be prepared to live with the answers. If you are listening to this and wondering where you would stand, ask the question honestly and then act on what you learn in ways that cost you something good. Reparation is not always comfortable, but it is the currency of true change. Before I close, one small request. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a rain you've stood in, or a table you have shared, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I would like to know which city kept you dry, and which made you learn. It rains tonight. I sit by the window and the drops trace stories down the glass. I wear no more pretense than a shawl. My children do not love me perfectly. None of them are the angel I hoped for. But there is patience in my house now, and there are hands that feed one another without asking who will pay the bill. If my story teaches anything, it is this. Wealth is not a ledger of trophies. Wealth is the willingness to stand in the rain with someone who needs you, not because they deserve it, but because you can.